The courtroom fell into a deafening silence, every eye fixed on the teenage girl standing before Judge Montgomery, her composed demeanor a stark contrast to the ridicule she'd endured moments before. The judge's face had turned an alarming shade of red, his previous smugness replaced by a look of utter disbelief as he stared at the document trembling in his hands. This is impossible, he stammered, his authoritative voice now reduced to a whisper. The seasoned prosecutors exchanged nervous glances, their earlier condescension evaporating into the tension-filled air. The girl, no more than 16, stood unwavering, her steel blue eyes fixed on the judge with an intensity that made even the bailiff shift uncomfortably. Just 15 minutes earlier, Judge Richard Montgomery had been doing what he did best, belittling those he deemed beneath. "Him, young lady," he had drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This isn't some high school mock trial. This is a federal courthouse, not your playground." The gallery had tittered, following his lead like a well-trained audience. The girl had remained silent, her long auburn hair neatly pulled back, wearing a simple charcoal grey suit that seemed at odds with her youth. "Your Honor," she had finally spoken, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the laughter like a blade. "I believe you'll find everything in order." She began citing legal precedents with the precision of a surgeon, dismantling the prosecution's arguments one by one. The snickers died away, replaced by murmurs of confusion and growing amazement. District Attorney James Harrison had jumped to his feet, his face flushed with frustration. "Objection, Your Honor. This child cannot possibly..." But his words trailed off as the girl produced a leather portfolio, handing it to the bailiff with a slight smile that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. Now, as Judge Montgomery struggled to form words, the document in his hands told an extraordinary story. The girl before him wasn't just any teenager playing at being a lawyer. She was Alexandra Chen, the youngest person ever to pass the state bar exam, a prodigy who had deliberately kept her identity hidden until this moment. The gallery erupted in whispers. Journalists who had come to witness what they thought would be a routine hearing scrambled for their phones. The story of a teenage legal genius exposing bias and prejudice in the federal court system would make headlines across the country by nightfall, but how had it come to this? The answer lay in the quiet suburbs of Seattle, where this remarkable story had begun 3 months earlier. It was a tale of justice, prejudice, and the power of defying expectations. A story that would change not only the lives of those in the courtroom that day, but the entire legal system itself. Alexandra stood perfectly still, her heart pounding beneath her composed exterior. She had spent years preparing for this moment, knowing that her age would be both her greatest challenge and her most powerful weapon. The sound of Judge Montgomery's gavel cut through the chaos, his attempt to restore order to his courtroom falling flat against the rising tide of astonishment. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he announced, his voice struggling to maintain authority. As he rose to retreat to his chambers, his eyes met Alexandra's once more. Gone was the condescending smirk, replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. He knew, as did everyone else in that courtroom, that everything was about to change. The young defendant seated behind Alexandra squeezed her hand, tears of hope streaming down her face. Natasha Martinez, a 17-year-old honor student wrongly accused of a crime she didn't commit, had placed her trust in the only person who had believed in her innocence. Another teenager who understood what it meant to be judged by appearance, rather than ability. As the courtroom buzzed with excitement and disbelief, Alexandra allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. The real battle was just beginning, but she had achieved her first victory, forcing them to see beyond their prejudices and preconceptions. The document that had shocked Judge Montgomery was just the beginning of what she had in store. The story of how Alexandra Chen went from being dismissed as a child playing dress-up to becoming the most talked-about legal defender in the state was about to unfold, and nothing in the Seattle federal courthouse would ever be the same again. The revolution in the justice system was about to begin, led by a 16-year-old girl who had just shocked the entire legal establishment to its core. 3 months earlier, in the tree-lined suburbs of Seattle's Ravenna neighborhood, Alexandra Chen sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by towering stacks of legal textbooks. The walls of her room told the story of a life balanced between two worlds. Academic certificates and debate tournament trophies shared space with posters of popular bands and photos of friends from her online high school program. At 16, Alexandra was far from a typical teenager. Her journey into the legal world had begun at age 6, when her father, Dr. James Chen, a philosophy professor at the University of Washington, began reading her bedtime stories from famous court cases. Instead of fairy tales, her mother, Dr. Natasha Chen, a renowned neuroscientist, had recognized early signs of exceptional intelligence in their daughter, but had insisted on letting Alexandra chart her own course. "Dad," Alexandra called out, her eyes fixed on a complex legal brief, "can you explain why the Supreme Court's ruling in the Martinez case seems to contradict their earlier position?" Her father appeared in the doorway, a warm smile crossing his face as he observed his daughter's intense concentration. "Why don't you tell me what you think first?" he responded, following their usual pattern of Socratic dialogue. This was how Alexandra had learned to think like a lawyer, through endless discussions and debates around the dinner table, challenging every assumption and examining every angle. But Alexandra's extraordinary abilities had come with a price. Early experiences had taught her the burden of being different. At age 8, she had corrected her third-grade teacher's explanation of the First Amendment, leading to uncomfortable parent-teacher conferences and whispers about her being too smart for her own good. By 12, she was taking online law courses from prestigious universities, hiding behind a username that revealed nothing about her age. The decision to keep her achievements private had come after a particularly painful incident at a youth legal competition when she was 13. Despite winning first place, the organizers had accused her of cheating, unable to believe that a young Asian American girl could possess such comprehensive knowledge of constitutional law. Her parents had wanted to fight the accusation, but Alexandra had learned a valuable lesson that day about the power of underestimation. Sometimes, her mother had told her that night, wiping away her tears, the greatest advantage comes from letting others underestimate you. Use their prejudice as your strength. Now, 3 years later, Alexandra had done exactly that. She had passed the bar exam under her legal name, Alexandra Ming Chen, but her credentials listed no photo, no age, nothing that would give away her identity. She maintained a deliberately low profile, working remotely on legal research for various firms, while completing her high school education through an accelerated online program. The catalyst for breaking her anonymity came one Saturday morning at the local community center, where Alexandra volunteered, helping immigrants fill out legal paperwork. A distraught woman had rushed in, dragging her teenage daughter behind her. Maria Martinez was in tears as she explained how her daughter Natasha, a promising student with a full scholarship to Stanford, had been arrested for a crime she couldn't have committed. "The security cameras were broken," Maria had sobbed, "and the only evidence they have is that Natasha matches a vague description, but she was at her debate tournament when it happened. They won't listen to us because you're Hispanic," Alexandra had finished quietly, understanding immediately. The case had struck a chord. Another teenager being judged by appearances rather than facts, just as Alexandra had been all her life. That evening, Alexandra had made a decision that would change everything. She approached her parents with a detailed plan. She would take Natasha's case, using her legitimate bar certification, but keeping her age hidden until the perfect moment. Her parents had been hesitant, concerned about the risks and the exposure. "Are you sure about this, Alexa?" her mother had asked, using the childhood nickname that only family knew. "Once you step into that courtroom, there's no going back. Your life will never be the same." Alexandra had looked at the photo of Natasha Martinez, a bright young woman whose future was at risk because of prejudice and assumptions. "That's exactly why I have to do this," she had replied. "Someone needs to show them that justice doesn't care about age, race, or appearance." Her father had studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then we'll support you. But promise me one thing. Don't let them make you bitter. Use this to make things better, not to seek revenge." Over the next few weeks, Alexandra had prepared meticulously, working late into the night building her case. She coordinated with Natasha's debate team coach, collected surveillance footage from businesses near the tournament venue, and constructed an airtight timeline proving Natasha's innocence. But she knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough. She needed to force the system to confront its own biases. The morning she had first walked into the Seattle Federal Courthouse, briefcase in hand, no one had given her a second glance. They had assumed she was someone's daughter, a student observer, or perhaps an intern. Their assumptions had been their weakness, and Alexandra had been counting on exactly that. Looking at herself in the mirror that first morning, straightening her newly purchased suit, Alexandra had remembered her mother's words about underestimation. As she pulled her hair back into a neat bun, she smiled, knowing that she was about to turn those prejudices into the ultimate weapon for justice. The Seattle Federal Courthouse loomed before Alexandra, its imposing marble columns stretching toward the gray October sky. She clutched her leather briefcase tightly, feeling the weight of the carefully prepared documents inside. Today would be her first official appearance as Natasha Martinez's attorney, and she had chosen her moment carefully. The preliminary hearing where the prosecution would present their evidence. "Are you ready?" Natasha whispered beside her, trembling slightly in her borrowed blazer. The past week had taken its toll on the 17-year-old honor student. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usual confident posture had given way to nervous fidgeting. "Trust me," Alexandra replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Just remember what we discussed. Don't react, no matter what happens in there." As they climbed the courthouse steps, Alexandra noticed District Attorney James Harrison hurrying past them, his attention fixed on his phone. She had researched him extensively, known for his high conviction rates and his particular zeal in prosecuting cases involving minority defendants. He hadn't even bothered to look at the defense attorney notification she'd filed, assuming this would be another easy win. The security guard at the metal detector barely glanced at Alexandra's bar card, waving her through with a dismissive gesture that suggested he thought it was some kind of student ID. Inside the courtroom, she and Natasha took their seats at the defense table, ignoring the curious glances from the gallery. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Richard Montgomery entered the courtroom. Alexandra had chosen this judge deliberately as well, knowing his reputation for bias would play into her strategy. The judge's eyes swept the courtroom, pausing briefly on the defense table with a look of confusion. "Case number 2025, CR 1879, State versus Natasha Martinez," the clerk announced. "Preliminary hearing for armed robbery charges." District Attorney Harrison stood, straightening his expensive tie. "James Harrison for the state, Your Honor." Alexandra rose next, her voice clear and professional. "Alexandra Chen for the defense." "Your Honor," the judge peered over his reading glasses, his brow furrowing. "Miss Chen, where is Ms. Martinez's attorney?" "I am her attorney, Your Honor." All my credentials have been properly filed with the court. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Judge Montgomery's face darkened. Young lady, this is a serious criminal proceeding. Where is your supervising attorney? I am a licensed member of the Washington State Bar, Your Honor. I don't require supervision. Alexandra maintained eye contact with the judge, her expression neutral, despite the condescension in his tone. Harrison turned toward the defense table, finally taking a proper look at Alexandra. His face shifted from confusion to amusement. Your Honor, surely this is some kind of joke. The defendant can't expect— I assure you, Mr. Harrison, this is no joke, Alexandra interrupted smoothly. Unless the state wishes to challenge my bar credentials, I suggest we proceed with the hearing. Judge Montgomery's jaw clenched, but he had no legal grounds to refuse her. Very well, he said tersely. Mr. Harrison, present your evidence. The district attorney launched into his case, describing how Natasha Martinez allegedly robbed a convenience store at gunpoint. The only evidence was a grainy security camera photo showing someone of similar height and build wearing a hooded sweatshirt, and a witness who described the perpetrator as a young Hispanic female. Alexandra listened intently, taking measured notes while ignoring the skeptical glances from the gallery. When Harrison finished his presentation, she rose slowly, pulling out a carefully organized folder. Your Honor, the defense moves to dismiss all charges against Ms. Martinez. Her voice carried authority that belied her youth. The state's evidence is not only circumstantial, but demonstrably false. Bold claims from someone who appears to be playing dress-up, Harrison scoffed. Judge Montgomery made no attempt to hide his smirk. Alexandra remained unruffled. I have here sworn affidavits from 12 witnesses, including 3 faculty members, placing Ms. Martinez at the state debate championship during the time of the alleged robbery. I also have time-stamped photographs and the official tournament, a video showing her delivering her winning argument at exactly 9:47 p.m., 7 minutes after the robbery occurred 15 miles away. She approached the bench, handling her evidence with practiced precision. Furthermore, the security camera footage from the gas station across from the convenience store shows the actual perpetrator is at least 5 inches taller than my client. I've included a forensic analysis confirming this. The courtroom had grown quieter with each word. Harrison's smug expression faltered as he flipped through the documents. Judge Montgomery's smirk had transformed into a scowl. Your Honor, Alexandra continued, the only evidence linking my client to this crime is her ethnicity matching a vague description. I would remind the court that young Hispanic female describes thousands of law-abiding citizens in Seattle. If the state wishes to proceed with such flimsy evidence, we're prepared to file a motion challenging the constitutional basis of this prosecution. She could see the wheels turning in Harrison's mind as he realized he had severely underestimated his opposition. The judge, however, wasn't ready to concede. Miss Chen, he said, emphasizing her youth in his tone, while your enthusiasm is admirable, perhaps someone with more experience should review these materials before we make any hasty decisions. Alexandra's eyes narrowed slightly. This was the moment she had anticipated. Your Honor, are you suggesting that my bar credentials are somehow insufficient? Or is there another reason you feel unable to evaluate evidence presented by someone who appears different from your usual counsel? The challenge in her voice was subtle but clear. Judge Montgomery's face reddened as he recognized the trap. Any further dismissal of her capabilities could be construed as discrimination. He glanced at the evidence again, his jaw working silently. The defense raises some valid points. He finally managed. Mr. Harrison, how does the state wish to proceed? The district attorney stood, his confidence visibly shaken. The state requests a brief recess to review this new evidence, Your Honor. Alexandra allowed herself a small smile. The first battle was won, but she knew the war was far from over. As the judge announced a 30-minute recess, she could feel the atmosphere in the courtroom shifting. The whispers had changed from dismissive to curious, and several senior attorneys in the gallery were now studying her with intense interest. Natasha grabbed her hand under the table, squeezing it tightly. "That was amazing," she whispered. "But they still don't know who you really are, do they?" "Not yet," Alexandra whispered back. "That revelation needs the perfect moment, and trust me, when it comes, no one in this courthouse will ever forget it." During the recess, Alexandra and Natasha sat quietly in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. The muffled sounds of hurried footsteps and urgent whispers filtered through the heavy wooden door. District Attorney Harrison's voice could be heard barking orders at his assistants, demanding background checks and verification of every document Alexandra had submitted. "They're scared," Natasha observed, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of water. "I've never seen Mr. Harrison look so rattled." Alexandra was about to respond when her phone buzzed. It was a text from her father. "Channel 7 news van just pulled up outside. Someone tipped off the media." She frowned, reviewing her mental timeline. She hadn't planned on media attention until later in the case. The door burst open, and a tall woman in an expensive suit strode in, followed by two younger attorneys. "Ms. Chen, I'm Margaret Whitfield, Chief Assistant District Attorney." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I wonder if we might have a word in private." Alexandra met her gaze steadily. "Anything you need to say can be said in front of my client." Whitfield's smile tightened. "Very well. We've reviewed your evidence. The state is prepared to offer a deal. We'll drop all charges against Ms. Martinez in exchange for your immediate withdrawal from this case." Natasha gasped, but Alexandra didn't flinch. "On what grounds would I withdraw?" "Let's be frank," Whitfield said, dropping her diplomatic tone. "We don't know how you got your credentials or what game you're playing, but this office has a 97% conviction rate. We will not be made a mockery of by some child prodigy trying to prove a point." Alexandra stood slowly, smoothing her blazer. "Ms. Whitfield, are you suggesting that the district attorney's office would rather drop valid charges than face me in court? That's quite an admission of either insecurity or impropriety. Which is it?" The older woman's face hardened. "This is not a game, Miss Chen. You're dealing with forces you don't understand. People's careers and reputations are at stake." "Yes," Alexandra replied coldly. "Like my client's future, which your office was willing to destroy based on nothing but ethnic profiling and lazy investigation. We'll see you back in court." After Whitfield stormed out, Natasha turned to Alexandra with wide eyes. "They're really scared of you, but why offer to drop the charges? Isn't that what we want?" "Because," Alexandra explained, "dropping the charges quietly keeps their misconduct hidden. This case isn't just about clearing your name anymore. It's about exposing systemic bias in the prosecution's office." The bailiff appeared at the door. "Court will reconvene in 5 minutes." As they walked back to the courtroom, Alexandra noticed several news reporters had somehow gained access to the building. Cameras flashed as she and Natasha passed, and she could hear the excited murmurs. "That's her, the mystery lawyer." Inside, the gallery had filled considerably. Several prominent defense attorneys had appeared, drawn by the rumors of a young prodigy challenging the powerful district attorney's office. Judge Montgomery looked even more displeased than before, if that was possible. "Mr. Harrison," the judge called out once everyone was seated, "how does the state wish to proceed?" Harrison stood, his earlier condescension replaced by carefully controlled anger. "Your Honor, the state has serious concerns about the defense counsel's qualifications and the authenticity of her evidence. We request a full investigation into Ms. Chen's credentials before proceeding further." Alexandra rose immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Harrison has had ample time to verify my credentials through the State Bar. His sudden concern appears to be a transparent attempt to delay proceedings because his case is falling apart. Watch your tone, young lady. Judge Montgomery warned. This court has a duty to ensure proper representation. Your Honor? Alexandra interrupted, her voice sharp enough to draw gasps from the gallery. Would you be questioning my credentials if I looked different? If I matched your preconception of what an attorney should look like? The judge's face turned purple. You are dangerously close to contempt, Ms. Chen. Perhaps, Alexandra responded, pulling out another document from her briefcase. But I'm not wrong. I have here a statistical analysis of this court's record over the past 5 years, showing a pattern of disparate treatment based on age, gender, and ethnicity. Would Your Honor like me to submit it to the record? The threat was clear. She wasn't just challenging this case, but the entire system's bias. Judge Montgomery's hands gripped his gavel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Additionally, Alexandra continued, her voice carrying through the now silent courtroom, I've prepared a motion detailing the prosecution's history of ethnic profiling in case selection. The media would find the numbers quite interesting, I believe. Harrison jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. She's attempting to blackmail... No, Mr. Harrison. I'm attempting to ensure justice, something your office seems to have forgotten about in its pursuit of conviction rates. Alexandra turned back to the judge. Now, shall we proceed with dismissing these baseless charges, or would the court prefer to explain its resistance to the Judicial Review Board? The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Alexandra could feel Natasha trembling beside her, but she kept her eyes locked on Judge Montgomery. She had pushed them into a corner, using their own prejudices against them. Now came the moment of truth. Would they fold or escalate? The answer came in an unexpected way. The courtroom doors burst open, and a man in an expensive suit walked in, flanked by 2 others carrying heavy briefcases. Alexandra recognized him immediately from her research. Robert Blackwood, the district attorney himself. Your Honor, Blackwood announced, his deep voice filling the room, the state requests a short recess to confer with new counsel. It seems we have a situation that requires my personal attention. Judge Montgomery seemed almost relieved at the interruption. Granted, this court will recess for 1 hour. As the gallery erupted in excited chatter, Alexandra gathered her papers calmly. She had expected the DA's office to call in their heavy hitters eventually, but Blackwood's personal appearance suggested they were even more rattled than she'd anticipated. The game was escalating, exactly as she had planned. During the recess, the courthouse corridors buzzed with activity. District Attorney Blackwood had commandeered a large conference room where animated voices could be heard through the heavy doors. Alexandra sat quietly in a smaller meeting room with Natasha, using the time to prepare for whatever was coming next. They brought in the district attorney himself, Natasha whispered, nervously picking at her sleeve. Is that bad? Alexandra was about to respond when her phone lit up with a message from Aaron Zhang, her childhood friend who now ran a legal research firm. Urgent. They're digging into your past. Someone's trying to access your school records. A small smile played at the corners of Alexandra's mouth. She had anticipated this move, and Aaron had been monitoring for exactly such attempts. All her records were legally sealed, part of the careful groundwork she'd laid over the years. Miss Chen? A young law clerk appeared at the door, looking somewhat flustered. Mr. Blackwood would like to speak with you. Alone. Alexandra squeezed Natasha's hand reassuringly before following the clerk. The large conference room had been transformed into a makeshift war room with laptops, documents, and coffee cups scattered across the massive table. Robert Blackwood stood at the window, his imposing figure silhouetted against the Seattle skyline. "Please sit," he said without turning around. The other attorneys quickly filed out, leaving them alone. "You've caused quite a stir, Miss Chen. Quite a stir indeed. I'm simply defending my client, Mr. Blackwood." He turned then, fixing her with a penetrating stare. "Let's drop the pretense. You didn't take this case by accident. You chose it, chose this courthouse, chose Judge Montgomery. The question is why?" Alexandra met his gaze steadily. "Perhaps I simply believe in justice." Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Justice? You're trying to embarrass my office, challenge the integrity of this court, and turn a simple robbery case into a media circus about systemic bias. That's not justice, that's activism." "Why can't it be both?" Alexandra countered. "Your office was willing to destroy a 17-year-old's life based on nothing but ethnic profiling. If exposing that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps the problem isn't with my methods." The district attorney's facade of amusement faded. "You're playing a dangerous game, young lady. We've been trying to access your records, but they're sealed remarkably well, almost as if someone was expecting us to look." "Almost," Alexandra agreed with a slight smile. "I'm going to be blunt," Blackwood said, leaning forward. "Whatever point you're trying to make, whatever crusade you're on, it ends now. Withdraw from this case, and we'll not only drop the charges against Ms. Martinez, but also overlook your unorthodox approach to practicing law." Alexandra's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood?" "Protecting you," he corrected smoothly. "You've made your point, but if you persist, we will be forced to scrutinize every aspect of your background, your credentials, your family. The media attention you've courted could become uncomfortable." "Interesting," Alexandra said, standing slowly. "You'd rather threaten a member of the bar than admit your office made a mistake. That says more about systemic bias than any statistical analysis could." Before Blackwood could respond, Alexandra's phone buzzed. Again, she glanced at it, allowing a genuine smile to spread across her face. "If you'll excuse me, I believe court is about to reconvene. And Mr. Blackwood, you might want to check your email before we return." Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Judge Montgomery looked like he had aged years in the past hour, and Harrison was huddled with his team, whispered conversations carrying an edge of panic. Blackwood entered last, his face noticeably paler than during their conversation. "Your Honor," Blackwood began, his voice lacking its usual authority, "in light of new information, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Natasha Martinez." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Montgomery frowned. "Mr. Blackwood, this is quite unusual. Just an hour ago, your office was questioning defense counsel's credentials." "Yes, Your Honor," Blackwood replied stiffly. "We withdraw those concerns." Alexandra stood. "Your Honor, the defense opposes dismissal at this time." The gallery erupted in shocked whispers. Natasha turned to her, confusion written across her face. Even Judge Montgomery looked startled. "Miss Chen," the judge said slowly, "you're opposing the dismissal of charges against your own client?" "Yes, Your Honor. The state's sudden reversal, while validating my client's innocence, appears designed to avoid addressing the serious misconduct this case has uncovered. We request an evidentiary hearing on the prosecution's pattern of ethnic profiling in case selection." Blackwood's face darkened. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The state is trying to do the right thing. Now," Alexandra interrupted, "after being confronted with evidence of misconduct, evidence which, I should note, includes emails showing the DA's office specifically instructing prosecutors to target cases involving minority defendants." The courtroom fell silent. Alexandra had just revealed her trump card, the real reason for Blackwood's sudden capitulation. The emails Aaron had uncovered and sent to the DA's office just minutes ago. Furthermore, Alexandra continued, pulling out another document. I have here a motion for a federal civil rights investigation into the systematic bias in case selection and prosecution within this jurisdiction. Unless the state is prepared to acknowledge these issues publicly and commit to specific reforms, I will be forwarding this motion to the Department of Justice. Judge Montgomery looked like he was about to explode, but Blackwood's face showed recognition. He understood now. This had never been just about Natasha's case. Alexandra had orchestrated every moment, every revelation, building to this point where they had no choice but to address the larger issues she had uncovered. The court will take a 30-minute recess, Judge Montgomery announced, his voice strained. All parties in chambers, now. As they rose to follow the judge, Alexandra caught a glimpse of the media frenzy building outside the courthouse windows. The story had grown far beyond a simple case of mistaken identity. By the time she was finished, the entire system would be forced to confront its own biases, and it had all started because they underestimated a teenage girl in a courtroom. The judge's chambers felt smaller than usual, crowded with tension and competing egos. Judge Montgomery sat behind his massive oak desk, his face a storm cloud of barely contained fury. District Attorney Blackwood stood by the window, his usual commanding presence diminished by the revelations of the past hour. Alexandra sat calmly in one of the leather chairs, Natasha beside her, while Harrison and his team huddled near the door. "Miss Chen," Judge Montgomery began, his voice tight with controlled anger, "you're walking a very dangerous line. These accusations against the district attorney's office are fully documented," Alexandra interrupted, pulling a thick folder from her briefcase, including statistical analysis of case selection patterns, internal communications showing explicit bias, and sworn statements from former prosecutors who were pressured to target minority defendants. "This is blackmail," Harrison burst out, his face red. Alexandra turned to him coolly. "No, Mr. Harrison, this is accountability. Something your office seems to have forgotten about." Blackwood cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should discuss this in privately without..." "Without what, Mr. Blackwood?" Alexandra's voice took on a sharp edge. "Without the defendant present to hear how your office systematically targets people who look like her. Without the young attorney you've been trying to intimidate?" She stood slowly, reaching into her briefcase one final time. "You've all been so focused on trying to discredit me that you never bothered to truly verify my credentials. Allow me to help with that." She pulled out a sealed envelope and handed it to Judge Montgomery. The judge opened it with visible irritation, but as he read, his expression transformed from anger to disbelief. His hands began to tremble slightly. This can't be right," he muttered. "What is it?" Blackwood demanded, moving to look over the judge's shoulder. His face went pale as he read. Alexandra smiled faintly. "As you can see, I passed the bar exam at age 14, setting a state record. My scores were the highest recorded in the past decade. I then spent 2 years working remotely for top law firms under my legal name, while they assumed I was much older. Every case I handled, every brief I wrote, every argument I constructed, all legally and professionally sound." The room had gone completely silent. Natasha was staring at her attorney with wide eyes, finally understanding the full scope of Alexandra's brilliance. "But that's not all," Alexandra continued. "The document also shows that I've been quietly building cases against discriminatory prosecution practices across 3 states. This case wasn't just about Natasha. It was about exposing a system that judges people based on appearance rather than facts." Judge Montgomery slumped back in his chair. "You orchestrated this entire situation. You chose this case, this court, because your record of bias was well documented," Alexandra finished. "You've dismissed every racial profiling claim brought before you in the past 5 years. You consistently give harsher sentences to minority defendants, and you regularly belittle attorneys who don't fit your perception of what a lawyer should look like. She turned to Blackwood. And your office, Mr. District Attorney, has a documented pattern of charging minorities more aggressively than white defendants for similar crimes. When presented with evidence of bias, you attempted to cover it up rather than address it. My God, Harrison whispered. She's been planning this for years. 2 years, 3 months, and 17 days, Alexandra confirmed. The exact amount of time it took to gather irrefutable evidence of systemic bias in this jurisdiction. Natasha's case wasn't the cause. It was the catalyst I needed to bring everything to light. The gravity of the situation settled over the room. Alexandra had managed something unprecedented, using her own youth and appearance to expose the very prejudices she was fighting against. "What do you want?" Blackwood finally asked, his voice heavy with defeat. "Comprehensive reform," Alexandra replied immediately. "Independent oversight of charging decisions, mandatory bias training for all prosecutors, and a complete review of cases involving minority defendants from the past 5 years. "That's impossible," Harrison protested. "The cost, the manpower, is less than what you'll face if I take this to the Department of Justice," Alexandra cut in. "The emails I have would trigger a federal investigation that would make today look like a pleasant chat." Judge Montgomery had been silently reading through the documents again. "You're 16 years old," he said, almost to himself. 16 years old, and you've managed to prove that age, race, and appearance have nothing to do with capability?" Alexandra finished. "Yes, Your Honor, that's precisely what I've done." She gathered her things and stood. "I've prepared a detailed reform proposal. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Either we announce a comprehensive reform initiative together, or I hold a press conference releasing everything I've uncovered. Given the media presence outside, I imagine it will be quite well attended." As she turned to leave, Blackwood spoke up. "You could have had a brilliant career in this office, you know. With your skills." "My skills," Alexandra interrupted, "are better used fighting for justice than perpetuating bias. Natasha's freedom isn't enough. The system needs to change." She opened the chamber doors, where the buzz of media and spectators could be heard from the corridor. "I'll expect your decision by 9 a.m. tomorrow. And gentlemen, remember, everything that happened today started because you couldn't see past your own prejudices. I suggest you learn from that mistake." As she and Natasha walked out, leaving the most powerful legal figures in Seattle sitting in stunned silence, Alexandra allowed herself a small smile. The revelation of her true identity had been perfectly timed, but it was only the beginning. The real work, transforming a biased system into a just one, was just beginning. The scene outside the courthouse was chaos. News crews jostled for position, their cameras trained on the entrance as reporters delivered breathless updates about the teenage legal prodigy who had just exposed systemic bias in Seattle's justice system. Alexandra guided Natasha through the crowd, deflecting questions with practiced ease as they made their way to where Aaron waited with a car. "You're trending on Twitter," Aaron announced as they slid into the back seat. "And every major news outlet in the country is trying to get your contact information. The videos of you entering the courthouse this morning have gone viral." Alexandra checked her phone, which had been buzzing continuously since leaving the judge's chambers. "My parents, safe at home, but reporters are already camping outside your house. I've arranged a hotel suite downtown where we can set up Command Central." Aaron navigated through the traffic, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror to ensure they weren't being followed. Natasha sat in stunned silence, processing everything that had happened. Finally, she turned to Alexandra. "You planned all of this? From the very beginning?" Not everything, Alexandra admitted. But I knew taking your case would force them to confront their biases. They were so convinced I was just a kid playing lawyer that they never stopped to consider why I seemed so prepared for their every move. Her phone buzzed again, a message from a prominent civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C. "It's starting," she murmured. "The national organizations are getting involved." At the hotel, they found a suite already transformed into a makeshift office. Laptops were set up on every surface, multiple screens displaying news coverage and social media reactions. Clara, Alexandra's mother, was coordinating with a team of volunteers who were documenting every piece of media coverage. "Sweetheart," Clara embraced her daughter, "you were magnificent, but the real fight is just beginning." Alexandra nodded, scanning the room. "Have they made any statements yet?" "The DA's office issued a brief, no comment an hour ago," Aaron reported. "But Judge Montgomery hasn't been seen leaving the courthouse. Sources say he's still in his chambers with Blackwood." "They're trying to find a way to discredit me," Alexandra said, settling into a chair. "But they can't. Every document is authenticated, every statistic verified, every witness prepared to testify." Natasha watched the activity with wide eyes. "I had no idea. When you took my case, I thought you were just trying to help me. But this is so much bigger." "It had to be," Alexandra replied softly. "Clearing your name was essential. But if we didn't expose the underlying bias, they would just do it to someone else. The system needs to change." A commotion at one of the monitoring stations drew their attention. "Breaking news," Aaron called out. "The State Bar Association is holding an emergency meeting. They're discussing your case." Alexandra smiled. "Right on schedule. Aaron, are the documents ready for phase 2? He nodded, pulling up a series of files on his laptop. "Everything's prepared. The moment they try to challenge your credentials or claim you misled them, we release proof that multiple bar officials knew my age when I passed the exam," Alexandra finished. "They kept it quiet because they didn't want the publicity, which makes them complicit in perpetuating age-based discrimination." Clara touched her daughter's shoulder. "Are you ready for what comes next? Once this goes national—" "I have to be," Alexandra said firmly. "We've spent 2 years preparing for this moment. Every case I worked on remotely, every brief I wrote, every legal argument I constructed, it was all building to this." Her phone buzzed with another message. This one made her sit up straighter. "The Reforms Committee from the DA's office wants to meet tonight." "Already?" Natasha asked. "Is that good or bad?" "It means they're scared," Aaron grinned. "They know Alexandra has them cornered. If they don't agree to reforms, the evidence goes public, and their careers are over." Alexandra stood, straightening her blazer. "Set up the meeting at 8. Here, not their office, and make sure the media knows about it. We want transparency from this point forward." As her team sprang into action, Alexandra walked to the window, looking out over the Seattle skyline. The city she'd grown up in, where she'd first discovered the inequities in the justice system, was about to face a reckoning. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Judge Montgomery himself. "You've made your point. What assurances do we have? That you'll honor any agreement we reach?" Alexandra typed back a single sentence. "Unlike your office, I believe in justice more than power." She turned back to the room where Natasha was watching news coverage of her own case with tears in her eyes. "I still can't believe you did all this for me," the girl whispered. "Not just for you," Alexandra corrected gently. "For every person who's been judged by their appearance rather than their actions. For every teenager dismissed because of their age. For every minority defendant presumed guilty because of their race." Clara approached with a stack of papers. "The reform proposals are ready for review. We've included everything from independent oversight committees to mandatory bias training, regular audits of charging decisions, and a complete review of past cases. Alexandra took the documents, her expression determined. They'll try to water it down, to preserve as much of their power as possible, but we have something they don't. What's that? Natasha asked. The truth, Alexandra replied. And after today, the whole world is watching. They can either be part of the solution or be exposed as part of the problem. Aaron called out from his station. Alexandra, CNN is requesting an interview. So are MSNBC, Fox News, and every major newspaper in the country. She shook her head. No interviews yet. First, we make sure the reforms are locked in. The media attention is just leverage. What matters is changing the system. As the sun set over Seattle, Alexandra reviewed the reform proposals one final time. In 3 hours, she would face the DA's reform committee. By morning, either Seattle's justice system would begin a historic transformation, or she would release evidence that would shake the legal establishment to its core. Either way, nothing would ever be the same. And it all started because they underestimated a teenage girl in a courtroom. The hotel's conference room had been transformed into a battlefield of a different kind. On one side sat Alexandra, flanked by Aaron and 2 civil rights attorneys who had flown in from Washington, D.C. upon hearing about the case. On the other side, District Attorney Blackwood led a team of senior prosecutors and legal advisors, their faces grim in the harsh fluorescent lighting. The Reforms Committee, consisting of 3 independent attorneys and a retired judge, occupied the middle ground, their expressions carefully neutral. Let's be clear about what's on the table, Alexandra began, her voice steady despite the late hour. We're not just talking about procedural changes or sensitivity training. We're discussing a complete overhaul of how cases are selected, charged, and prosecuted in this jurisdiction. Blackwood leaned forward, his tie loosened after the long day. Miss Chen, while we acknowledge certain inconsistencies in our processes, what you're proposing would essentially put our office under permanent supervision. Oversight, Alexandra corrected. Not supervision. And yes, that's exactly what we're proposing. The statistics don't lie. Mr. Blackwood, in the past 5 years, your office has charged minorities with felonies at 3 times the rate of white defendants for identical offenses. She slid a document across the table, watching as the committee members reached for their copies. Page 7 shows the disparity in plea bargain offers. Page 12 details how your office systematically overcharges minority defendants to force and plea deals. And page 15, she paused, meeting Blackwood's eyes. Page 15 shows emails directing prosecutors to, and I quote, make examples of certain defendants based on demographic factors. The room fell silent as the committee members flipped through the pages. One of them, Judge Margaret Thompson, retired from the federal bench, removed her glasses with a shaking hand. These numbers are disturbing. Disturbing? Alexandra raised an eyebrow. They're criminal. If these documents were to become public, it wouldn't just end careers. It would trigger a federal civil rights investigation that would paralyze the entire district attorney's office. That sounds like a threat, one of Blackwood's attorneys growled. No, Alexandra replied calmly. It's an opportunity. Instead of facing public scandal and federal intervention, you have the chance to become a model for reform, to show that the system can acknowledge its flaws and actively work to correct them. Aaron pulled up a presentation on the large screen behind them. We've outlined a comprehensive reform package that would implement immediate changes while building long-term accountability. He began clicking through slides, each detailing specific proposals. First, Alexandra continued, mandatory review of all charging decisions by an independent panel with specific attention to racial and demographic factors. Second, creation of a community oversight board with real power to investigate complaints and recommend action. Third, comprehensive bias training for all prosecutors with regular testing and evaluation. Blackwood's team shifted uncomfortably as she continued. Fourth, a complete audit of all cases from the past 5 years where defendants received sentences exceeding prosecution guidelines. Fifth, implementation of a blind charging system where prosecutors don't see demographic information until after making initial charging decisions. This is impossible, Harrison interrupted from his position near the door. The cost alone would be far less than defending against civil rights lawsuits. Alexandra cut in. We've included a budget analysis, showing that these reforms would actually save money in the long run by reducing wrongful prosecutions and appeals. One of the civil rights attorneys, Diana Washington, spoke up. We've also secured commitments from several national organizations to provide funding and resources for the transition. This isn't just about Seattle anymore. Cities across the country are watching. Alexandra stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city lights. In the past 12 hours, my team has received calls from 37 civil rights organizations, 12 major media outlets, and 9 congressional offices. By morning, that number will triple. This is happening, Mr. Blackwood. The only question is whether your office will be remembered as an obstacle to justice or a pioneer of reform. Judge Thompson cleared her throat. Miss Chen, these proposals are comprehensive and well-researched, but what guarantees do we have that you won't release the evidence anyway, even if we agree to the reforms? Alexandra turned back to the room. Because unlike the current system, I believe in accountability, including my own. I'm prepared to sign a binding agreement that ties the evidence to compliance with reforms. If the DA's office implements and maintains these changes in good faith, the evidence remains sealed. And Natasha Martinez's case, Blackwood asked quietly, is a perfect example of why these reforms are necessary, Alexandra replied. An innocent teenager nearly had her life destroyed because your office relied on racial profiling instead of actual evidence. How many other Natasha Martinezes are sitting in jail right now because they didn't have someone to fight for them? The Reforms Committee huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. Alexandra returned to her seat, accepting a cup of coffee from Aaron. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m. They'd been at this for nearly 4 hours. Finally, Judge Thompson spoke for the committee. We've reviewed the proposals and the evidence. Our recommendation is that the District Attorney's Office accept these reforms in full with quarterly reviews to ensure compliance. Blackwood closed his eyes, the weight of the moment visible in his expression. When he opened them, he looked older, more tired. Miss Chen, may I speak with you privately? Alexandra nodded, following him to a small adjoining room. Once the door closed, Blackwood's professional facade cracked slightly. You know, I've been in this office for 23 years. I thought I was one of the good ones, fighting for justice, upholding the law. Maybe you were, Alexandra said softly, but the system you upheld was fundamentally flawed. Good intentions don't excuse systemic bias. He ran a hand through his graying hair. Do you know what I keep thinking about? That first day in court, how we all dismissed you because of your age. We did exactly what you knew we would do. We underestimated you based on appearance rather than substance. Just like your office does to defendants every day, Alexandra pointed out. Blackwood nodded slowly. You didn't just expose our bias. You made us experience it firsthand. It's masterfully done, actually. He paused, studying her. You could have had an extraordinary career in prosecution. I prefer to fight for justice, not convictions, Alexandra replied. Are you ready to do the same? The district attorney was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he straightened his shoulders. I'll sign the reforms package, but I want your word that if we comply in good faith, you'll work with us, not against us. Help us build a better system." "That was always the goal," Alexandra said, extending her hand. "Justice shouldn't depend on what you look like or how old you are. It should be truly blind." When they returned to the conference room, the atmosphere had shifted. Blackwood walked directly to the reforms document and signed it, followed by each committee member. As the last signature was added, Alexandra felt the weight of the moment. In less than 24 hours, she had transformed from an unknown teenager to someone who had just reshaped the criminal justice system in one of America's major cities. Aaron began distributing copies of the signed agreement to all parties. "We'll release a joint statement in the morning," he announced. "The reforms begin immediately." As the room began to clear, Judge Thompson approached Alexandra. "I've been on the bench for 30 years, she said quietly, "and I've never seen anything quite like what you've accomplished today. You've given us all a lesson in true justice." Alexandra gathered her files, exhausted but satisfied. The real work was just beginning, but the first and hardest step had been taken. As she left the conference room, she saw Natasha waiting in the hotel lobby with her mother. "Is it done?" Natasha asked anxiously. Alexandra smiled, holding up the signed agreement. "It's done, and not just for you, for everyone who deserves fair treatment under the law." Maria Martinez hugged her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "How can we ever thank you?" "Help us make sure these reforms work," Alexandra replied. "Your story, your courage in fighting back, it's going to inspire others to stand up for justice." As they walked out into the cool night air, reporters, still camped outside the hotel, called out questions. Alexandra paused, looking at their eager faces, then at Natasha and her mother, and finally at the signed agreement in her hand. "Miss Chen, can you comment on the negotiations?" She turned to the cameras, her voice clear and strong. "Today, Seattle's justice system took the first step toward true reform. But this isn't just about one city or one case. It's about recognizing that justice should never be influenced by age, race, or appearance. The real work begins tomorrow, and we invite everyone who believes in fairness and equality to join us." The cameras flashed, capturing the image of a 16-year-old girl who had just changed the system by forcing it to confront its own prejudices. Tomorrow's headlines would tell the story, but the real impact would be measured in the lives of countless future defendants who would now have a chance at true justice. The days following the historic agreement brought a whirlwind of activity. Alexandra's hotel suite had transformed into a full-fledged command center, with volunteers manning phones, coordinating with civil rights organizations, and tracking the implementation of reforms. Screens displayed news coverage from across the country, all featuring the same story: the teenage legal prodigy who had forced systemic change in Seattle's justice system. "Los Angeles just called," Aaron announced, hanging up his phone. "Their public defender's office wants to launch a similar reform initiative. They're requesting our data and proposal templates." Alexandra looked up from her laptop where she was reviewing the first batch of case audits from the DA's office. "Send them everything. The more cities adopt these reforms, the harder it will be for others to resist." Natasha, who had become a regular presence in the command center, was helping organize incoming requests for assistance. "Alexandra, you need to see this," she called out, turning up the volume on one of the news channels. On screen, a panel of legal experts was discussing the Seattle reforms. "What we're seeing here is unprecedented," a former federal prosecutor was saying. "A 16-year-old girl not only exposed systemic bias, but created a blueprint for reform that could be implemented nationwide." The camera cut to another panelist, a civil rights attorney. The genius of Miss Chen's approach was forcing the system to experience its own bias firsthand. By allowing them to underestimate her based on age and appearance, she created a mirror that showed them exactly what they do to defendants every day. "Turn it off," Alexandra said quietly. "We need to focus on implementation, not publicity." She turned to the wall of monitors tracking reform progress. The first independent review panel had already evaluated 50 cases, finding concerning patterns in 37 of them. Clara entered the room carrying fresh coffee and a stack of newspapers. "Sweetheart, the governor's office called again. They want you to chair the new state commission on judicial reform." Alexandra shook her head. "I can't. The moment I take an official position, people will try to dismiss this as a publicity stunt. We need to keep the focus on the reforms themselves." A commotion at the door drew their attention. Diana Washington, the civil rights attorney from D.C., burst in waving a document. "Alexandra, we just got word from Chicago. 3 defendants are filing appeals citing your findings. They're arguing that the same biased practices you exposed in Seattle affected their cases." "Good," Alexandra replied, pulling up a new document. On her computer, "Send them our statistical analysis template. They'll need to prove similar patterns in their jurisdiction." Aaron's phone buzzed again. His expression turned serious as he listened. "We might have a problem," he said, after hanging up. "Judge Montgomery is giving interviews, trying to spin this as a wake-up call for the justice system. He's positioning himself as a champion of reform." Alexandra smiled grimly. "Let him. The more public statements he makes, the harder it will be for him to backtrack on the reforms. Besides," she added, pulling up a folder of emails, "we still have plenty of evidence we haven't released." Natasha approached Alexandra's desk hesitantly. "There's something else. Some of the comments online. They're saying you must have cheated on the bar exam, that there's no way someone so young could be this qualified." "Of course they are," Alexandra sighed. "It's easier to believe in conspiracy theories than confront their own prejudices." "Aaron, prepare a release showing my complete academic record and bar exam results. Full transparency." Clara watched her daughter with concern. "You haven't slept more than 4 hours a night this week. Maybe we should—" She was interrupted by a loud commotion in the hallway. A moment later, Robert Blackwood strode into the command center looking agitated. "Miss Chen, we need to talk, privately." Alexandra nodded to her team and followed the district attorney to a quiet corner. "What's wrong?" "The reforms are causing chaos in the office," Blackwood said, his voice tense. "Half my prosecutors are threatening to resign rather than have their decisions reviewed by the independent panel. They're saying it undermines their authority." "Their authority to show bias," Alexandra countered. "Good. Let them resign. Replace them with prosecutors who care more about justice than power." Blackwood ran a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple. These are experienced attorneys. Training new prosecutors while implementing reforms is exactly what we agreed to," Alexandra finished. "Change isn't supposed to be comfortable. Mr. Blackwood, your prosecutors are used to unchecked authority. Of course, they're resistant to oversight." Before he could respond, Diana rushed over with a tablet. "Alexandra, you need to see this. The State Bar Association is holding an emergency session. Someone's filed a complaint challenging your admission to the bar, claiming your age makes you inherently unqualified." Alexandra took the tablet, scanning the complaint. "Interesting. They're arguing that emotional maturity should be a prerequisite for bar admission." "Aaron," she called out, "get me the psychological evaluation I underwent before taking the bar exam, and the letter from the bar examiners acknowledging my age." "Already on it," Aaron replied, typing furiously. Blackwood watched the exchange with growing understanding. "You really did think of everything, didn't you? You anticipated every possible challenge." "I had to," Alexandra said simply. "The system was never going to change willingly. Every step forward will be met with resistance." That's why we documented everything, built redundancies into the reforms, and created multiple layers of oversight. Natasha, who had been listening nearby, spoke up. But what happens when you're not here to enforce it? You can't stay in Seattle forever. Alexandra smiled, gesturing to the room full of volunteers and advocates. That's why we're building a movement, not just implementing reforms. Every person in this room is learning how to monitor compliance, gather evidence, and push for change. The system tried to destroy your life, Natasha. Now you're helping to fix it for others. Diana returned with more news. The national civil rights organizations are calling for similar reforms in every major city. They want you to consult on implementation. No, Alexandra said firmly. Send them our templates and data, but each city needs to find its own champions. This can't be about me. It has to be about justice. Blackwood cleared his throat. My prosecutors want to meet with you, not to argue against the reforms, but to understand better. Would you consider speaking to them? Alexandra considered this. Yes, but not alone. Bring in some of the defendants who were wrongly charged. Let your prosecutors hear their stories. Make them see the human cost of bias. As if on cue, Aaron called out from his station. Alexandra, the first review panel just completed their analysis of cases from the past month. 23% showed clear evidence of racial bias in charging decisions. Send that data to every news outlet, Alexandra instructed. The public needs to see that we're not just making accusations, we're proving systemic bias with hard numbers. Clara approached with a fresh cup of coffee and a gentle reminder. You have the national press conference in an hour. Do you want to review your talking points? Alexandra shook her head. No script. I want to speak from the heart about why this matters, about how a system that judges people based on appearance or age or race isn't just unfair, it's dangerous. The command center buzzed with renewed energy. On the screens, more cities were reporting similar reform initiatives. The movement was growing, spreading beyond Seattle like a rising tide. Alexandra watched her team at work. Natasha organizing case files, Aaron coordinating with other jurisdictions, Diana preparing legal briefs for appeals cases. Mr. Blackwood, she said quietly, your prosecutors who are threatening to resign, tell them to look around this room. These are people who believe in justice enough to fight for it. If they can't do the same, maybe they're in the wrong profession. The district attorney nodded slowly. You know, when you first walked into that courtroom, I thought you were just a kid trying to prove something. I was wrong. You were trying. To fix something that the rest of us had been too comfortable to acknowledge was broken. Alexandra turned back to her work, but not before adding, sometimes it takes a child to point out that the emperor has no clothes. Your prosecutors can either help make things right, or they can be remembered as obstacles to justice. Their choice. 6 months had passed since the day Alexandra Chen first walked into the Seattle Federal Courthouse. The Hotel Command Center had long since been replaced by a proper office in downtown Seattle, now serving as headquarters for the newly established Justice Reform Initiative. The walls were covered with maps showing cities implementing similar reforms, news clippings documenting successes, and photographs of families reunited after wrongful convictions were overturned. Alexandra sat in her office reviewing the latest progress report. Seattle's reforms had exceeded even her optimistic projections. The independent review panel had evaluated over 1,000 cases, identifying and correcting hundreds of instances of biased prosecution. More importantly, the culture was changing. New prosecutors were being trained with bias awareness as a fundamental principle, and the Community Oversight Board had become a model for other cities. Alexandra, Natasha knocked on the open door. She had transformed over the past months from a scared defendant into a confident advocate, now leading the initiative's youth outreach program. The conference call with Chicago is about to start. They're implementing the final phase of reforms. Walking to the conference room, Alexandra passed walls lined with letters from families across the country. Each one told a story of justice, delayed but finally delivered. The reforms she had sparked in Seattle had spread like wildfire, with 12 major cities now following similar protocols. "There she is," Aaron called out as she entered. He had multiple screens displaying faces from across the country. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, and reform advocates all waiting to discuss progress. Chicago's ready for the final push. Alexandra took her seat at the head of the table. "Good morning, everyone. Let's start with the numbers." A prosecutor from Chicago's office, a woman who had initially resisted the reforms, spoke first. "We've reviewed 60% of cases from the past 5 years. The bias patterns you identified in Seattle. We found similar issues here. But the new protocols are working. Charging disparities have dropped by 47% since implementation." "What about resistance from within the office?" Alexandra asked, thinking of the early days in Seattle. "Less than we expected," the prosecutor replied. "Your approach, using data to prove bias rather than just alleging it, makes it harder to deny the problem. Plus, the younger attorneys are actually enthusiastic about the changes." Diana, Washington, who had become a permanent part of the team, added her report. "We're seeing similar results in Atlanta and Miami. The Seattle model is working. When we combine statistical analysis with personal stories, it's powerful. Prosecutors can't ignore the numbers, and judges can't ignore the human impact." Alexandra nodded, making notes. Judge Montgomery's words from their last encounter echoed in her mind. He had pulled her aside after a reform committee meeting, looking older and more humble than she'd ever seen him. "You know," he had said, "I've been on the bench for 20 years, thinking I was dispensing justice equally. It took a 16-year-old to show me how wrong I was. That's a hard pill to swallow, but an important one." The conference room door opened, and Clara entered with a stack of newspapers. The headlines told the story of spreading change. "Reform. Movement reaches West Coast. Bias review overturns dozen of convictions. Teen reformers model goes national. Los Angeles called," Clara whispered to her daughter. "Their DA wants to implement even stronger reforms than Seattle's. They're asking for your input on the proposals." Alexandra raised her hand for quiet in the conference room. "Before we continue with progress reports, I want to address something important. These reforms aren't just about changing procedures or implementing oversight. They're about changing how we think about justice itself." She stood, walking to the wall of letters from families. "Every one of these stories represents a failure of the system, a time when someone was judged not by evidence, but by appearance, age, or race. Our success isn't measured just in statistics, it's measured in lives restored, in faith renewed in the justice system." The screens showed nodding faces from across the country. These were no longer skeptics fighting change. They were partners in reform, each with their own stories of transformation. 6 months ago," Alexandra continued, "I walked into a courtroom knowing I would be underestimated. I counted on the system's bias to prove its own flaws. But the goal was never just to expose problems. It was to fix them. And that's happening, not because of me, but because of all of you who chose to be part of the solution." Natasha, who had been quietly taking notes, spoke up. "Tell them about the education program." Alexandra smiled. The program had been Natasha's idea, using her case and others to teach high school students about justice and bias. "Thanks to Ms. Martinez here, we're not just changing the current system, we're preparing the next generation to demand better." The Chicago prosecutor leaned forward. "That's actually why we called this meeting. We want to expand the education initiative nationwide. Use these cases, these reforms, to teach law students and future prosecutors about systemic bias and how to fight it We're starting law clubs in high schools, Natasha added excitedly. Students learning about justice by studying real cases, understanding how bias affects decisions. Some of them are already talking about becoming reform advocates. A defense attorney from Atlanta joined in. The ripple effects are incredible. We're seeing judges voluntarily requesting bias training. Prosecutors are creating diversity committees with real power. And conviction rates for minority defendants are falling in line with overall averages for the first time in decades. Alexandra returned to her seat, letting the discussion flow around her. This was what she had hoped for, not just policy changes, but a fundamental shift in how people thought about justice. Her phone buzzed with a message from District Attorney Blackwood. Thought you'd want to know. Last month's charging decisions showed no statistical bias across demographic groups. First time in office history. Aaron caught her attention, pointing to another screen where news was breaking. The governor was announcing a statewide adoption of Seattle's reform model, with Alexandra's Justice Reform Initiative designated as the oversight body. More importantly, the announcement included funding for public defender offices and community legal aid. It's really happening, Natasha whispered, watching the governor's speech. Everything you said it would. Alexandra squeezed her hand. No, everything we said it would. Every person in this room, every advocate across the country. We're all part of this change. The meeting continued with reports from other cities, each sharing successes and challenges. Alexandra listened, taking notes, but also observing the faces on screen. These were the same legal professionals who, 6 months ago, would have dismissed a teenage attorney without a second thought. Now they were partners in reform, each contributing to a movement that was reshaping American justice. As the meeting wound down, Diana presented the latest national statistics. Bias-related appeals were up 300%, but with an unprecedented success rate. More importantly, new charging decisions showed dramatic improvements in fairness across all demographics. One last thing, Alexandra said as the meeting neared its end. Remember why we started this. Not just to fix procedures or improve statistics, but to ensure that every person who enters a courtroom is judged by the facts of their case, not by their appearance or background. We're not just changing rules, we're changing lives. The screens filled with affirming nods and determined faces. As the calls ended one by one, Alexandra remained in her chair, looking at the wall of letters. Each one represented a life touched by reform, a small victory in the larger battle for true justice. Ready for tomorrow? Natasha asked, gathering her notes. The Congressional Committee wants to hear about expanding the reforms nationally. Alexandra stood, straightening her jacket. Ready, because this time they won't be seeing a teenager they can dismiss. They'll be seeing the results of what happens when you judge people by their capabilities, not their appearances. The Seattle sunset painted the office in golden hues, illuminating the maps showing the spread of reforms across the country. What had started with one case, one courtroom, and one underestimated teenager had grown into a movement that was reshaping the very foundation of American justice. And this was just the beginning. If you were inspired by Alexandra's incredible journey from an underestimated teenager to a force for change in America's justice system, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You'll never miss another story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to make our world a better place. Did Alexandra's story touch your heart? Let us know in the comments below what you thought about her brilliant strategy to expose systemic bias. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear this powerful message of courage and determination. Remember, sometimes the biggest changes come from the most unexpected places. See you in the next video.